Well, first with us today is Jock Finlayson. He's Executive Vice President, Chief Policy Officer at the Business Council of B.C. If you want to check it out, and go to Business in Vancouver's column, and he wrote a column there talking about some economic policy advice that the Business Council of British Columbia has for the new government that's been led by the NDP, but with some backing from the Green Party as well. Now to share with those recommendations, it's Jock here. I want to thank you for joining us today on the show.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity.
So it's been an interesting week, let's say, for the start of this new government. We had Petronas come out and say that they're not moving forward the Pacific Northwest LNG project. They say it's market conditions. Other people say maybe politics are playing some sort of part. What's your take on this current situation as we start moving forward with this new government, Jock?
Sure. Well, I don't want to belabor the Petronas decision. I mean, it's been speculated about for a long time that they were going to pull out and or sort of indefinitely postpone their project. And markets have been very unfavorable for the development of LNG in British Columbia for the past 3 or 4 years. And the outlook isn't particularly bright. In other words, we're not likely to see sharply escalating LNG prices in Asia. Canada is a pretty high-cost jurisdiction to operate. Nationally, the Trudeau government has said we're going to move toward a framework of carbon pricing all across Canada. BC's further ahead, but as we move out to 2021, 2022, carbon prices will be rising everywhere, including here. And I think that was a concern as well. And then on top of that, you had the political change in BC, which at the margin, I'm sure it didn't help, but I take the company at its word that wasn't the main factor.
So you don't think the NDP were the straws that broke the back of the camel in this case?
I think it may have had some role, in finalizing the decision.
Because they were talking about getting a better deal. They wanted a different tax deal. They certainly wanted a greater inclusion of First Nations in some of the decision making. Largely speaking, and of course taxing carbon at a higher rate. All of these things were going to work in a way to make the project, make the environment for the project less enticing.
Yeah, although I guess I would say, the NDP voted in favor of the Liberal legislation that laid out the fiscal regime for LNG, and they have given no indication they're going to move away from that.
Yeah.
But I think, there's been a lot of rumors in the market about this project for quite some time. So I don't think it would be fair to sort of lay the blame for this decision on the NDP. However, I think, again, at the margin, I suspect the arrival of a new government had some impact.
Do you sense a little bit of a backing away on the Kinder Morgan pipeline issue on the basis of a little bit of a greater understanding on the part of the NDP about what might ensue if, for instance, it begins to do things like to slow down the permitting, to do anything like that might impede the project's development? Because there was slightly different wording this week in that ministerial directive than what I saw in the supply and confidence agreement with the Greens.
And also in the campaign. When people take power and get briefed by their officials, go through the transition binders, have a look at the books, and begin to take on the responsibilities associated with actually governing, it does sometimes affect their thinking and temper the language they use.
Unless you're Donald Trump.
Mr. Trump is the exception that proves the rule.
Yeah, right.
And so, I mean, BC, and I think the Petronas decision plays into this. We have to be sensitive to our reputation as a place to invest, particularly in large projects. Our reputation in the capital markets, in the corporate boardrooms of North America, among people who manage institutional money. This is a big deal. Canada's already facing some real challenges on that front. We've acquired a reputation as a country, as a place that is preoccupied with process, that moves, at sort of glacial speed to make decisions, and which doesn't seem very hungry to attract capital and new business. Whether that's fair or not, I'm not going to say, but it is very much the reputation that's kind of floating around out there. BC's part of that. We've got our own challenges. But this bigger Canadian reputational challenge is affecting us as well. So I do think Premier Horgan and his colleagues do need to keep an eye on that and not sort of worsen what is already, I think, a deteriorating Canadian reputation in the capital markets, while they try and go about executing on their own agenda. Clearly, I understand they have to do that. But in doing it, they've got to tread pretty carefully, in my view.
Because they don't want to have the reputation in 2017 and 18 and 19 that an NDP government had in the 90s, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was a long period. They were in office there for 10 full years. I wasn't here during all of it. We had the Asian financial crisis, which threw the economy into recession in kind of 98 and 99, which was the latter part of their 2 terms. And I'm sure Mr. Horgan has pretty strong memories of all that. So, yes, having a kind of an across-the-board conflictual relationship with the business community, seemingly on every major policy file, is probably not the way to go. And I don't think our new premier wants to go down that path,
or the new finance minister, for that matter.
Yeah, or the new government. I mean, they're going to, they are a different party. They are Social Democrats. They're going to play. They have a different view on the role of government in economic and social affairs. I respect that. But our reading of it, at least right now, is they're going to try and engage with business in a constructive way. We're not going to agree on everything, but we're not going to fight on everything either. And I think that's kind of the mutual understanding that we start with. And the proof will be in the pudding as we move forward.
Well, of course, I mean, they are inheriting, best economy among all the provinces right now, at least the one that's fastest growing at this point. You said, maybe their minds change when they take a look at the books. Well, they've got an extra $2 billion to play with that they weren't necessarily expecting. What do you think is maybe step one for them to really put forward what their mandate's going to be when it comes to dealing with business, the economy here?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say their platform, which was successful from their point of view, election platform, had a pretty strong focus on social and environmental objectives and redistribution and affordability and all of those themes. It was a bit lighter on what I would call the economic development side and around the challenges of building a competitive economy. So if I was in their position, I'd be looking to sort of round out their narrative, if you will, by bringing forward more sort of ideas and thinking around how we develop the economy. So one thing that would be very helpful, I think, especially given the lack of NDP members in the northern 2/3 of British Columbia. I think they only have 4 seats. I think one thing that would be very helpful is if they sent some strong signals in the first throne speech and budget and in perhaps speeches by the Premier and the Finance Minister, who's the Deputy Premier, that clearly recognizes the central place that natural resource industries have and will continue to have in BC's prosperity. I mean, I know they believe that, so I'm just saying it would be helpful to articulate it. I'm not sure all their colleagues fully understand it in caucus. Certainly the new Premier does. And we would like to hear that. I'm sure a lot of communities would like to hear it, especially in wake of the Petronas decision.
Yeah, because in the same way that Justin Trudeau's government evolved rather quickly after its election, after its campaign, that had seemed at times to be rather antagonistic toward resource development in certain ways. It got with the program in a certain way, and is that where you want the NDP government to move as clearly as that?
I'm just saying I think they need to flesh out their economic program in more detail than we've seen so far, and that's not a criticism because most opposition parties that rise into government, I mean, they have work to do once they get there. And I think that what I do worry about a little bit is we have a province that's increasingly urban in terms of where the demographics are going. Certainly the NDP government is dominated by Metro Vancouver to a large extent, Southern Vancouver Island as well. And I worry about that a little bit just because it could lead to kind of an unbalanced understanding of how we butter our bread here in BC. I think, for example, of the excitement around the clean tech industry that I hear constantly articulated by political leaders, including in the Trudeau government, but certainly in this government. And we have companies in that space. It is a growth industry. But I estimate that the Canfor Corporation, in all its different component parts, probably exports 4 to 5 times more in dollar terms than the entire clean tech industry. So I'm not saying clean tech isn't a growth industry or the government should ignore it. I'm just saying you need a sense of perspective and proportion.
But it is politically excitable in an urban setting to point to tech and not to point to things like the hewers of water and drawers of wood.
Fair enough. And clean tech is actually only a small slice of tech. There's another, the biggest part of the technology space in British Columbia is ICT and the digital economy. I mean, that's probably 80% of the BC tech industry in terms of gross domestic product. So, if our politicians talked a little more about the full sort of spectrum of our technology space, which is an exciting part of the economy and it's tremendous growth potential in BC, but it's not necessarily it's not primarily a clean tech story.
Yeah.
Clean tech's a contributor, but we're talking about a very small industry here. So just a few numbers to put things in context, because we do have a diverse economy in BC. It's one of the reasons we are doing well. It's interesting, the oil price collapse that hammered Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Newfoundland left almost no imprint here. And that's, we don't produce a lot of oil, but it's also because we've got a diversified basket. But the fact is 75% of our exports still come out of resource industries. 2/3 of our manufacturing production is still concentrated in resource-based industries. The government directly gets $4 to $5 billion a year from resource production activity, probably another $3 or $4 billion indirect revenue, income tax, sales tax, and so on. And our new government will be understanding that as they get the briefings from their officials. So we need to continue to nurture this part of our economy while recognizing that there are good growth prospects elsewhere. It's not a question of, this isn't the 1950s. It's not all about resources, but they're still pretty foundational.
The largest public concern remains, of course, housing in our province. And it is, again, principally a concern of those in the Lower Mainland, but it's becoming more so in the interior, more so on the island. What are you expecting in the way of any kind of fine-tune, or what would you like to see in the way of a fine-tune of the policies that the Horgan government has so far proposed in order to deal with that?
Sure. Well, we did mention that in the BIV column that Tyler referred to in a very abbreviated fashion. I think there is still work to be done on the demand side, and by that I'm thinking in particular of the role of foreign capital and foreign investors in our real estate market and some of the issues that have arisen around that. When people say, well, there's only 8 or 9 or 10% of real estate transactions are by foreigners, I mean, I kind of laugh at that. Most urban centers in North America, the percentage would be 0 or 1. I mean, 8 or 9 or 10%, as we see in Metro Vancouver and also Toronto area, is a very high proportion of your housing market transactions to be driven by people who don't live here, if you think about it that way. I'm not talking about immigrants who've moved here. These are people who are actually residents somewhere else. So it seems to me we don't have any compelling need to attract foreign capital into housing. We've got lots of domestic demand for that and lots of capital floating around. So maybe there's more that could be done on that side. You think about the speculation and the pressures that we've seen in recent years. It's not clear to me why the capital gains exemption on a principal residence should be immediate for anyone who owns it. If you're actually living here, why not make it time limited? Or time sensitive, in the sense that if you owned a home for 3 years, you would qualify for the full capital gains tax exemption, and you might back it up from there. I mean, these are things that at the margin could cool demand a little bit. On the supply side, we recommend in our column, and I think the NDP is in alignment with this, I think it's really time to focus more on the rental side of the housing market. 35% of Lower Mainland households rent. The city of Vancouver is 51%. I would argue that in the future, those numbers are going to go up simply because of the gap between median wages and the cost of housing
unless there's no supply.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as an economist, my view is land prices are going to continue to go up in the Lower Mainland with dips with the business cycle. But we've got a constrained land supply and population growth driven by immigration. I don't see where land prices come down. So that tells me that the housing price problem, the cost of land, is not going to get fixed because it's kind of hardwired into our geography and our demographics. So we need to be paying more attention to the people who are actually priced out of the housing market, and there are growing numbers of them, and be doing more to develop purpose-built rental stock aimed really at middle-income earners. And that's where I would like to see more emphasis by government. And I think, we'll see. I think the NDP might be aligned with that.
But can't the province exert some more influence on the municipalities when it comes to freeing up the supply side of things when it comes to changing bylaws? Because right now it's not politically tenable for a lot of these municipal politicians to start making these single family homes like zoned in areas that we're going to see a lot more density. They're going to be worried about getting reelected again. Do you think it's time for the province to step in?
I think there's a role for the province to try and increase what we economists will call the elasticity of housing supply, which is basically when you have a strong price environment, you'd like to see the supply responding fairly expeditiously. Because of municipal processes, we often see that doesn't happen. So I would like to see a faster kind of development process at the municipal level. And I think the province has a role in that through sort of moral suasion, but maybe through using some tools that they could develop legislatively. Because ultimately the municipalities they have no constitutional status themselves. They are actually creatures of the province.
Yeah, although we do have a Vancouver charter. And
but that could be changed by the city.
By the
province.
Yeah,
And Vancouver's sort of unique in that regard, as you know. But I think, the province has got to take a leadership role if they want to help address this on the supply side for sure. There's also a lot of, and this is super controversial, but I mean, we got a lot of land in the Lower Mainland locked up in green space parks and agricultural land reserve. And in fact, more than 60% of the entire Metro Vancouver area is really off limits for development. Now, I think politicians will tinker with that at their peril. But again, at the margin, I suspect there might be, parcels of land that are classified as ALR, for example, that aren't being used for productive farming. Why is something locked up in the agricultural land reserve if it has not been used for agricultural purposes in a meaningful way, and it is unlikely to be? So, I mean, we would like to see a review of those things. Whether the new provincial government is prepared to do that, I don't know.
Yeah. One area that I know the council and the Board of Trade, virtually every business organization now has thrown itself into in terms of support, and yet I still saw, I wouldn't call it tepid, but I didn't see something really concrete in the NDP Green Plan was childcare in this province. Potentially the largest emancipator of women into the workforce, one of the greatest economic contributors that could happen here. What's the right path, do you think, for this government around improving the situation for childcare here?
Well, they're definitely committed to moving on that, and we actually support a greater focus on early childhood programming and development. We think that the target should really be low and middle income households rather than a sort of immediate move to a universal $10 a day childcare program,
or clawed back if it's going to be.
Yeah. So I think and as I say, as an economist, there's actually a fair bit of support among people who've looked at this. That there is a payoff, not only in terms of an increased participation rate by women, mothers in the workforce, but because we could probably get that up a few percentage points if we had better supports for childcare. But if you have high quality childcare and early childhood development programming, it tends to produce better outcomes in terms of
20 years later.
Quality of human capital. Yeah, I mean, the problem is you don't get the payoff immediately. So I think as a society, it does make sense to move on that. But, it could be pretty expensive depending on how it's designed and implemented. And one of the issues for the new government will be what can they afford. And I think you'll see them do a sort of incremental step-by-step expansion of childcare capacity as fiscal circumstances permit, but in line with the platform commitment. And I think at a high level we're supportive of that. We're not supportive of an immediate move to a universal $10 a day program, which would be super expensive and also very complicated to roll out.
Mm-hmm. I mean, can you look at, say, the Quebec model and see whether or not that would actually translate over here to British Columbia?
Yeah, there's mixed kind of reviews on the Quebec model. One thing I would point out is Quebec has by far the highest tax burden. So, I mean, it is a choice for citizens if we want programs like that to be expanded and run and funded through government. We have to be prepared to accept a substantially higher tax burden. And I didn't see I don't think our political class has kind of confronted that yet. In Quebec, I guess there's more of a consensus or more support in the society for very high tax rates that people are prepared to pay. It was kind of what I call the French model. In France, the government is 57% of GDP. In Canada, it's about 41%. So we could go further down that path. I think it'd have some undesirable consequences, but ultimately it's a democratic choice.
Well, look, you allude to the choices that people make, and often they elect governments not all the time knowing what might be in store behind the curtain. What do you think the tolerance is in British Columbia for higher taxes?
I don't know that. I mean, I think there's a view, and I'm quite concerned about this. I mean, there's a view that the so-called rich, affluent taxpayers can pay more, and indeed the NDP platform commits to bringing in a new tax bracket at the top,
150,000, I think. Yeah.
That will move our combined federal provincial top marginal rates on the most productive entrepreneurs and workers in the province, judged by their incomes. It'll move that up to 50%. We were 43.7% 2 years ago. The first Trudeau budget took a step in that direction, so we're at 47.7% now, and I would suspect we'll be around 50 after the NDP mini budget is brought down in September. That's not the end of the world, but I think when you start to get tax rates that high on productive people who you want to be here, you want them to be living, working, creating jobs, and paying taxes in British Columbia. You don't want them to go elsewhere or drop out of the workforce. I do worry about the threat of tax rates climbing even further beyond that level. And it's one of the points we made in our article, is sort of a caution to the new government not to go down. But I don't know I'm not an elected official. It'd be better to ask someone who's running for office and who's been successful what they think the public tolerance for higher taxes broadly is. I don't think it's very great, to be candid. Remember the referendum here on TransLink.
Yeah, right.
Well, they're not trying that
funding
again.
shot down in flames.
They're not trying that one again.
But I think it's a bit of a sign. And the NDP theme in their campaign was heavily geared to affordability for sort of middle-income households. So that doesn't sound to me like they believe there's a lot of room for most British Columbia households to pay more tax.
Well, excellent, Jock. Always great having you on the show. I want to thank you for joining us today.
Great. Enjoy the rest of the summer.
Thank you. That's Jock Finlayson. He's the Chief Policy Officer at the Business Council of British Columbia. You're listening to Business in Vancouver on Roundhouse Radio 98.3. I'm Tyler Orton.
I'm Kirk Lapointe. We'll be back in a moment.